Greetings, friends. It's Michael Parker, and welcome back. In today's episode, we meet Mike DiVicino, aka Mikey D. He spent 29 years behind bars due to his crimes and alleged ties to the Italian Mafia. After a high-speed chase through Los Angeles in 1990, he was arrested and the DA threw the book at him because he would not cooperate. He was sentenced to serve 3 life sentences, the rest of his natural life in a maximum security prison. Mike describes that time behind bars as pure hell, yet he refused to join any prison gangs and instead dedicated his life to helping other inmates see that there could be hope and a life beyond the walls, if they chose it. We discussed that journey of purpose and survival after the birth of his son, who was conceived during a conjugal visit, and how he maintained his humanity in such a primal environment. You spent 29 years in jail?
Yes, that's correct, Michael.
Tell us about yourself. So, from what I'm understanding, you were supposedly involved with the mob. Is that true? And what did you do with the mob?
Well, certainly the allegations were such, Michael. To give you a brief clip of my youth leading up to, I began getting in trouble, Mike, at a very young age.
Yeah.
And certainly there was a heavy Italian influence in Las Vegas, the city I was raised in at that time. And it wasn't ever too far from the household, that influence. And I saw the inside of my very first lockup facility at the age of 12, continued regrettably to cycle in and out of the various systems. And it came to culmination with what you shared with our viewers, if you will, about it all culminating with me being sentenced while in my 20s, being arrested while in my 20s for the last time for a host of crimes, all tied to Italian organized crime.
Now, when you were arrested here in LA, but you grew up in Vegas. You're now back in Vegas. Were you born and raised in Vegas?
Yes, Mike, I was. In fact, I was the only one in my family who was born in Las Vegas. The rest of my family originates from the East Coast.
When I think of mafia movies and things, I think of the East Coast, and especially when you mention, Italian Mafia, that's what I think of just in a cinematography sense. Mike, by the way, am I saying your last name correctly, DiVicino?
Yes, the American version, that is correct.
Good.
The Italian version is DiVicino.
DiVicino, that's way better. DiVicino is way better. So that sounds great. All right. So anyway, so you're here in LA and you're in a high speed pursuit, I guess, and they bust you, and then you get three different charges.
Actually, Michael, it was a lot more charges than that. And what led me to LA originally was because I had been in trouble. I was getting deeper and deeper involved. I was looking for a place to land, if you will, between the East Coast, California, needed to leave Vegas, was getting in just too much trouble here.
Mm-hmm.
And I went from the fire into the frying pan, landed in LA, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah. Late 80s, early 90s, LA was rough. I mean, it's rough now for similar but different reasons. But at that point, man, crime was through the roof here in LA.
It was. And regrettably, you had mentioned something in your earlier commentary leading into our interview, speaking about uniting humanity and not being a plague on this earth. Most regrettably, Michael, I was that plague. I was involved with things that were plaguing humanity. And during the time that I ended up being sentenced to multiple life prison sentences and was in fact in maximum security prison, I wanted my legacy to be something much more than a trail of bad decisions that led me there.
29 years in prison. You survived that. You came out the other side and somehow you found salvation and tried to help other folks. But just talk about
high security prison, 29 years, man. What is that like?
It's a consummate war zone, Michael. There is very little rest, if you will. I was a guy who, because of my refusal to join any of the numerous prison gangs, I somewhat walked through that inferno on my own, if you will, at least in the physical sense. And I'm really not quite sure how to sum up nearly 30 years being spent in a cage, other than to say it was pure hell, Mike. And I, in fact, was fortunate enough, of course, and determined to turn my life around. And as you alluded to begin trying to make a difference with the youngest of the inmates, prison gang members. It was hell in a sentence.
Well, let me ask you this. You just mentioned that you refused to join any of the gangs, and I've never been in prison, but it seems to me like when you're in prison, one of the ways that you try to protect yourself is you oftentimes get aligned with some kind of a gang. How did you have the strength to not join any of the gangs? Because I'm sure there was immense peer pressure to do so.
And there certainly was, Mike. For me personally, my refusal to join in any of the number of prison gangs, as I alluded to, it was the determination, Mike, that my life needed to count for something much more, as do each of the lives, in my opinion, of those who wind up there. And it was that determination that pulled me through that, Mike, and whatever powers to be that I believed in that guided me.
Are you a big person? I just have a headshot. I mean, and the reason I ask this is just because prison, I mean, if you were able to do that and find the strength to not join one of these groups, I'm guessing that you're physically imposing.
I don't know about that, Mike. I'm
okay.
Maybe a little bigger than average, where you conceive of a man's stature. I mean, nothing special about that. Little over 6 foot, Mike, couple 100 pounds. But perhaps more importantly, Mike, was my insistence, as I've mentioned, to not join in the prison gangs, and in fact, to the contrary, to try and make a difference while I was there. No, that was not well received. I have to tell you initially, Mike, but it was more important for me to do right than to be popular, if you will.
I get it. So
doing right, as we all know, forgive me, Mike, is not always the popular thing to do.
For sure.
However, it's necessary, and that's part of the message today, right?
Absolutely. That's why we're here. I applaud what you're doing. I'm just trying to understand it. Prison just seems like a place that I never, ever want to go. I don't know. I'm just trying to understand how you had the strength. And listen, if you were already involved in crime from a young age, how did you get into prison and find the strength to do the right thing after spending many years not doing the right thing?
That's a good question, Mike. Again, I had an epiphany of sorts while I was in there. Early on, my first and only son had been conceived, what's known as a conjugal visit. And for your viewers / listeners who don't know what a conjugal visit is, if you are legally married, Mike, and you earn that privilege, then you have the option, if you will, a couple times a year, you earn the privilege to spend time in a sort of trailer there on the prison grounds with a significant other, a spouse, a wife. And that was the case with me early on. I had only been sentenced to 6 years when I was initially arrested, Mike. During those 6 years, I had married a woman who I had been dating. I had opened up a tanning salon there in Los Angeles, which was actually a front for my criminal activities.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman I'd been dating when I was arrested, we decided to get married. And I was to be released in, I believe it was October, November, Mike, of 1993. And I'd been arrested in 1990. During that time, my first and only son was conceived. However, during those next 3 years, instead of me being released, I began getting indicted for my ties and involvement with the Italian organized crime. And pretty soon I landed back in the courtroom where I was ultimately sentenced not to be released in 1993, but to never again see the outside world. Hence the multiple life prison sentences.
That had to be crushing.
It was, but I couldn't let it be, Mike. It absolutely was. It threw my world upside down for a moment, but I had to get my footing. And as I've said, Mike, I absolutely needed my life to count for something much more than I had given it to.
That's powerful. Mike, help me understand this. So you're first in jail for 6 years. During those 6 years, you come up against additional charges related to your activities with the mafia. So what cases were being brought that you were then attached to while you were incarcerated? How did this go down?
Evidently, Mike, one of the Italians, or who I referred to as the bent noses, one of the Italians that I had gotten what I had considered close to, unbeknownst to me during the time that I'd gotten close to this individual out of Boston, the entire time, Mike, he had been wearing a wire on me and several others throughout the country, and several other Italians. And I didn't find that out until years later when I was back in the courtroom from prison, and I realized that this individual, who we'll call Frankie, had been wearing that wire in an attempt to get his own brother out of prison, who was serving time for murder.
Yeah. Now this comes up. Now you're sentenced to 3 life sentences and you're going to be in. How do you eventually, what happens that transpires to have you get out? If you're at 3 life sentences, but you're out now, how did this happen?
I think there was a number of factors there, Mike. Number one, I was overcharged, if you will, and I certainly wasn't any innocent person in any of this, no innocent bystander, but I had been overcharged. And ultimately, a couple of different attorneys throughout the years were able to correct, if you will, those overcharges to where I was ultimately eligible for parole. And that came nearly 30 years later. And I'd like to go back to something, if I can, Mike, that you have been asking.
Yes.
And because I'm not accustomed to speaking to any of this, Mike, I'm a very old school guy who has always kept that. Thank you. Who has always kept, and when I say always, I'm talking a lifetime. I've kept everything. I've played it close to the vest. And because of me not being proud of any of it, I would never certainly want to glorify, nor do I glorify anything to do with criminal activity, serving hard time in prison. There's enough glorification about all that, and I think we need to erase that.
Yep.
Dear Joey will be one attempt. I hope that does effectuate some change. But Mike, my earlier years in maximum security prison in California, that is a brutal system and compared to many of the other systems. And it was my willingness, dare I say, to shed blood myself early on to establish that I was willing to go to the extreme, to walk that prison yard and many of the other maximum security prison yards, being willing to die for what it is I believed in. I think Darwin called it self-preservation, and we all have that in us. And I was willing. And that's what set the table, I believe, Mike, for me to go ahead and walk it the way I ultimately did. And I'm very grateful, by the way, looking back, that ultimately that was respected.
So if I'm interpreting what you're saying, is you had to get in some fights. You had to fight back physically to establish that you were not going to be picked on or abused.
That is absolutely correct.
Got it. Okay.
Fighting is one thing, Mike, but in prison, one's willingness to fight is an absolute necessity. And early on, as I say, and I'm not accustomed to speaking about this, but it was my willingness, as are most of the others, at least in the maximum security prisons, you have to be willing to use a shank and or a knife, Mike. And God knows that I have my puncture wounds mostly in the back, not in the front, engaging at different levels of violence.
I understand. Well, and the reason that I asked my initial questions is because it was leading this. It is all about self-preservation, and I was just trying to understand how you did what you did, yet you remained human enough to not want to join a gang, and also to help your fellow inmates see that this was, or spread the word outside of the prison system that this was not the way to go. So you maintained some sense of humanity in this inhuman environment.
Very well put, Mike. I did, and I give all credit, as I say, to the gods and the powers to be for that.
So you were a Christian, or?
I was raised Catholic, Mike.
Yep.
My father is Italian, my mother is Jewish, but we were raised with a heavy Italian influence. I was Catholic, moved through my Christianity, dare I say that, to where today now I'm just a very spiritual being. I believe all things are connected for good when we do good with them, Mike.
I'm with you, and I understand that. And let me ask you this: if you had not had a spiritual sense or aspect of your personality, do you think you would have survived that experience?
Oh, very interesting question. I don't believe I've ever been asked that by loved ones, friends, or otherwise.
Really?
No,
Okay.
I have not. Very interesting.
It seems fundamental to me.
And it perhaps probably is fundamental. You know, Mike, I don't know, as I sit here and ruminate over that, I think I would have been totally given, now that you're mentioning this, to that primitive man, Mike. I'd have been given to primitive man. That's my answer. Had I not had the spirituality in me that I long have?
Well, that makes sense to me. So, well, clearly you had that because you were inspired to not join the gangs. You were inspired to be your own man. So let's talk about the book. So the book is a compilation of letters from fellow inmates. Did you start this early on? Was this midway through the experience? How did this come to be?
Okay, so that's two or threefold in and of itself. So early on, when I had my awakening inside a maximum security prison that I needed to do and to be more, I began educate myself, Mike, and I began to author prison programs for the benefit of all those who found themselves behind maximum security prison walls and otherwise. And as time went, and prior to that, I began mentoring to mostly the youngest of the inmates and gang members who had crossed the threshold into maximum security prison. And it was one day, Mike, that I was in a cell block standing there with one of my, who I call my youngsters, my nephews, my pseudo nephews. And I was standing there with a particular young gang member, mentoring to him in one of the cell blocks, as I said. And I had long been trying to figure out, how do I reach those who, like this particular youngster and so many others, had already thrown their lives away? How do we reach those before they wind up in the system? And it was in that moment, Mike, that the inspiration for Dear Joey, Letters from Prison, was conceived. which is this literary work, that one of the many goals here is to get these books, these literary works, into the schools, into the hands of young people before they throw their lives away, Mike.
In some of the documents that I have about you, when publicists are telling me about various guests, and I'm reading about your book, and some of these just snippets, examples of some of these people, like a guy misses out on a professional football career. I don't know what kind of trouble he got into, but he says, I missed out on the dream life of playing in the NFL, and now he wakes up in a prison cell every day. I just bring this up because it's one of the ones that stuck out to my mind. And another thing that I'm thinking about, when you're describing mentoring these young men in prison, I'm thinking that some of these gangs are looking at you and thinking, well, wait a minute, he's cutting into our action, because if he's talking to these younger inmates and trying to get them to do the right thing, that means they're not going to join our gang. So that couldn't have been a popular thing either.
That's absolutely correct. That's very deep insight, Mike. That's absolutely true. However, as I said, it was much more important to me to do right than to be popular. And a lot of the guys, for your listeners that aren't familiar with the vernacular that goes along with prison gangs and gangs otherwise, shot callers. So a shot caller, Mike, is the head or heads of the various gangs. And we're speaking about inside at the time, those that are inside. And I had, when I was writing my prison programs, and I sought to get the various shot callers involved, to get them to buy into there was much more to life than being a gang member. And when I got slowly but surely started getting some of them to buy into the fact that there's much more value to human life than certainly the label of being a gang member, pretty soon I knew that would filter down to their soldiers in these gangs. And that's how that kind of took off and segued into me spreading the positive message and trying to impart a little bit of the wisdom that I had learned, that, look, there's much more value to life than what we've given ourselves credit for, or otherwise have been given credit for.
Well, that in it alone is a very interesting subject to me. Like, what would you have to offer these shot callers, these leaders of the gangs? What is it that you said to them? The ideas that you're purveying don't really go along with joining gangs. So what is it that you were saying to these leaders that eventually persuaded them to at least buy into a portion of what you had to say, to the amount that it would filter down to their soldiers? What were you telling them that got through to them?
That's a great question. And best that I can remember, Mike, because I'm still a bit overstimulated just since being released from prison, going on 3 years now. It's overstimulating just being out here. But to answer the question as squarely as I can, and I know I keep banging the same drum, Mike, but it happens to be my truth and the truth, is there's so much more to life than what we've allotted or otherwise been allotted to ourselves. There's so much more to life. And one of my earliest prison programs, Mike, and this all goes squarely to your question, I had titled Lifers for Change, I Have Dreams Beyond These Walls. And in that program, Mike, that I had laid out, it's all right there in the title. It's summed up, Mike.
Yes.
Lifers for Change, I Have Dreams Beyond These Walls. And that extends, of course, first and foremost, to those of us that were in there, were serving life, those that were gang members, criminals, etc. There's so much more to this thing called life, Mike. And I was very fortunate that some of them, to answer your question, some of the shot callers in the various max joints in California, I think they started having the awakenings of their own, if you will, while trying to maintain some form of control, if you will, over their prospective gangs. And they began, as I say, I think the message was, it's just not worth it. And there's so much more to life.
Wow. I could talk to you for 3 hours. I have so many questions. You talk about, and I'm not trying to get away from the book, but every time you say something, it spurs additional thoughts. You talk about this experience now of being out and being overstimulated. And I've heard from other folks that sometimes the experience of the inmate who's now free in the world, you called it overstimulation. I've even heard some people say that they actually miss the confines of prison because they can't find a way to reassimilate into society. Is that a common phenomena?
Which part are you asking is if it's a common phenomenon, Mike?
How often do inmates get out and it's just too much? They can't handle the experiences of freedom, the responsibilities, and they actually miss prison because in prison, your only responsibility is to survive.
Absolutely true. Number one is survival. That being said, yes, it is a common phenomenon that the overstimulation, being out here, trying to fit into a system that many of us had fought against, whether we were raised to fight against the system, to not buy into the system, etc. I was speaking with one of my one-time youngsters, in fact, just yesterday, Mike, who had done, I think it was just over 20 years himself. And he had shared with me just yesterday, Mike, very bright kid, very determined, out here working very hard. And he was expressing to me, and I saw the stress drip. I heard the stress, I should say, dripping off him of being out here, now all the responsibility, et cetera, and many of who I call my guys, that every one of them have a piece of my heart, Mike, because the system has got to change. It's just too much for many of them, especially those who have served extended periods of time in a cage, Mike, that they just can't handle it. And they sadly go back to prison.
Mm-hmm. When you say the system's got to change, what do you mean by that exactly? Okay.
So what I mean by that is me being a guy that was basically raised in the various systems, Mike. I believe the figure, I may not be completely current, the figure that is spent on the prison industrial complex here in this country annually, I believe is well over $80 billion a year, Mike. And that's not to include hidden costs that are incurred by family members visiting their loved ones. Over 2.2 or 3 million people incarcerated at any given time in this country. The money's being spent by family members, many of whom come from disadvantaged backgrounds to begin with, don't have the monies. When I think of the takeaway, which I have for many, many years in those cages, that I spent in those cages and trying to figure out, damn, how do we make a difference, Mike? A collective difference. Prison is a necessary evil, and I think we all know that.
Yeah.
However, when we think about $80+ billion a year being spent to incarcerate here in this country, can't we find different alternatives, Mike, collectively, to better spend the money? Because guess what? If you look at the recidivism rates, Mike, they haven't plummeted by any means. In fact, they spike. They continue to increase. So clearly, the $80 billion+ being spent each year can be better spent somewhere else. And that's just my take on that, Mike.
You know, you said earlier in the interview that you're not necessarily used to doing these kind of things, but I think you speak very well. I'm very glad that I have met you via this. I want you to come back because I think that the message that you have is powerful. And you raise a very interesting point in regards to prison in response to my point that I said I have a lot of law enforcement people on here. So on one hand, we're trying to get rid of this DA here in LA. He's super soft on crime, and we don't really get why he's doing what he's doing. But on the other hand, you also raised the very good point that the prison system, an $80 billion industry, is not really working. So there must be a better way to do this, because you don't want to be soft on crime, but you don't want to make a criminal worse through a bad system. So there's got to be something between the two that we can do in the 21st century to make this better for society, and then those who are behind bars, to rehabilitate them and have them not return to that.
Totally agreed. And you haven't brought this topic back up. It's totally agreed. And what I saw for much of my life, Mike, particularly from behind bars, behind prison walls, electric razor wire fences, the disadvantaged, of course, whoever that is all inclusive of, are disproportionately behind bars. And
Yes.
I don't have all the answers, Mike. However, the lack of proper structure, guidance, love at home, broken families, etc., that plagues us all. And that being said, if we could start putting perhaps more resources into communities, family structures, programs, that's probably a really good place to start, Mike. And as I said, unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, but I'm certainly willing, and I feel we all need to join this conversation.
Mike, what I take away from you is something that I've talked about this in ambiguous senses on the show before, because I'm very concerned with society in the present. This is not the future that I thought we were going to have. When I look at American cities, I didn't think it was going to be like this. It seems like it's actually getting worse instead of getting better. And I have to believe that a portion of that is a move away from a sense of spirituality, a connection to something. I'm not saying you have to be a Christian or be anything, but just a connection to something. And I feel like we've moved away from that. When you talk about families and you talk about trauma, you talk about substance abuse leading to potential criminal activity, which then leads to incarceration. I don't know what it is that we have to do, but I think that there is a spiritual aspect of modern society that's dissipating, and it's leading to a decay, which unfortunately winds up with young men and women with their lives ahead of them being caught up in this system and then spending their lives behind bars.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that, Mike. Listen, no matter what walk of life we come from, this gap needs to be bridged, and it is only seems to be widening. We need to bridge the gap. Let's figure out a way to forget about, if not work through our differences, whatever those may be, come together collectively. And, I don't want to go off topic here, but me coming out to a foreign thing called social media, which did not exist when I went to prison while in my 20s back in 1990. This, the social media today, what I stepped out to, and I'm seeing it daily, and it seems, for those who have a voice, Mike, that social media would be a great platform if used correctly.
Yes.
To get a message out, to start uniting humanity, something you touched on earlier in your broadcast. Let's start using these platforms for good, Mike. And
Amen.
That might be another wonderful place for us to start as a whole.
When you got out of prison and you got this smartphone, it helped you continue your testimony, your ministry, as it were, to spread your message. And I think you're doing a really good job. I think that your observations on social media, it's like, I'm one of those guys, I bitch and moan about these things, but we have to change our point of reference on these things and look at the platform as how can we use this in this positive sense instead of just dwelling on them, complaining about this, that, and the other thing, and try to use these tools to help others. You're certainly doing that with this book. And if I can help you spread the word further, I want to do that. Do you go out to do public speaking to schools or youth groups?
I've been working toward that, and I'm working toward that now, Mike.
Good.
With all the violence that's going on in the schools, I do have a small team of individuals, both male and female, who had fallen through the cracks, came from less than perfect backgrounds, as I myself, broken, less than perfect, who had done significant amounts of time in prison, Mike, and they're now waiting to go back inside, not only waiting, but eager to go back inside with me to share a message of hope that we could do it. So could you. And again, this is a movement that needs to be created and continued upon. And we need individuals from every facet of life to get involved with this. Listen, whether we want to be or not, we're all in this thing called life together. Let's start acting like it. Let's support one another.
On August 4th, 2019, Michael DiVicino was released from prison after nearly 30 years. The inmate known as Mikey D had not only transformed his own life, but the lives of those around him. Mike is now taking that passion into the communities he had been locked away from for so long and is mentoring youth and those recently released through the reassimilation process into society. You can find out more about Mike DiVicino and his book, Dear Joey, Letters from Prison at MikeyDSpeaks.net. Friends, thank you for listening to the podcast. Please feel free to share the show on your social media. Give us a thumbs up, a like, subscribe. Help me keep making this content for you. If you're looking for me on social media, I am on most of the big ones, and you can find me as Michael Parker, LA. I'd be humbled and grateful for your support. Till next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.